So I'm an American in a very conservative Muslim nation, trying to get the stories, trying to bring those stories home, and praying to God every single night that, that it was worth the risk and that I would come back the next day, because so many people didn't. Covering the war is different for a woman than it is for a man. That's a fact. I know there's some of you out there that think it's all gender fluidity and cisgender and whatever the heck that is, and the Sith Lord, but it's a lot different when you're a woman. And I was thinking about that the other day, talking to my producers and actually talking to my husband about it, because it was such a different world. I mean, when you think about America's longest war, the 20 years in Afghanistan and the time we spent in Iraq, it was certainly life-changing. At least for me, it was. And I think for many people in our nation who experienced what happened to our country after September 11th. But it was really what was happening in the battlefields that taught me so much, not only about myself, but about us as humans, about how we react to one another, how we handle things in the worst of times, how we even find a sense of humor in the worst of times, with the idea that death could be around any corner at any minute. And that's really what it was like. I remember, and I'm going to go into more detail, obviously, as we go on into the podcast, but I remember talking to troops about that, men or women, that feeling. And I think that's where a lot of that weird PTSD comes from. But that idea that you're playing this game of like Russian roulette, really, in a war zone. No matter where you go, no matter where you travel, is there a bomb underneath this Humvee that I'm driving in, or, this MRAP? Will an IED go off while I'm in Kabul shopping for something? Will an IED go off while I'm working out at my hotel in Islamabad? Will something go sideways while I'm in Kurdistan? Or will something happen while I'm just hanging out with, the troops inside a foreign operating base? This idea that something can always happen, it keeps you on high alert. That's the same, I think, for both men and women. But the reason why I say women have a different perspective on covering wars, especially in the Middle East, and maybe in general, was that we had enormous access to not only the men that we were interviewing, but female sources as well as children. If you were a male journalist, it was very difficult to get an interview with a woman, especially in Afghanistan and in some other parts of the Middle East. I mean, you'd never be able to do it, right? Just can't have that access to women. So that was a whole, dimension of reporting that many men did not have access to. It was also extremely dangerous as a woman, enormous risks as a woman. And I'm not talking about just the idea of getting blown up or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the kidnappings, the idea that, I guess even men could be raped, but the idea that you could be, violated. And we saw the horrors of that happen when my friend Lara Logan was covering the war in Egypt, and how terrible that was for her. And it's just an absolutely different world. It's surreal. And a lot of times I'm talking to people right now about what it is to be surreal, right? We feel like we're living in a surreal country sometimes. I would say I get that, because I was in very surreal situations in war zones where it was hard for me to understand like life back to normal. It was war culture and it was about survival. And believe it or not, the war had its funny moments. And I'll talk to you about that and some of the more terrifying moments in a minute. But first, I want to tell you about fast-growing trees. I want you to breathe some life back into your own backyard. I want you to breathe some life back into your family and connect with them and go out and plant and enjoy the beautiful outdoors this summer and grow beautiful trees with your family that are right there at your fingertips. I'm not joking. You can go on to fastgrowingtrees.com. You can have your own personal nursery assistant who will help you select the right trees for your area of the country, your region. I'm region 8. whatever region you live in, you'll find those plants and those trees, and you'll grow these amazing, beautiful trees. You'll beautify your yard, your apartment, your front yard, whatever it is, whatever project you want to do, and you'll be able to do it with your family. Just getting away from that television, getting away from all the distractions and our cell phones, which I got right here, one on me. But you'll get away from all of that and find time to reconnect. And that is the most important. That is the most important thing that you can do for your family. And with Fast Growing Trees, 30-day Alive and Thrive guarantee, you know everything will look great, folks. Join over 1.5 million happy Fast Growing Tree customers. Go to fastgrowingtrees.com/Carter now and get 15% off your entire order. Get 15% off at fastgrowingtrees.com/Carter. That's fastgrowingtrees.com/Carter. So let's talk about the war zone. Let's talk about the craziness. I used to tell my friends that going back to Afghanistan, okay, let me start with the first time I was in a war zone and just how incredibly nerve-wracking and extraordinarily exciting and terrifying it was all at once, like just one big, incredible feeling. And it wasn't like I'm going there with bodyguards and a bunch of friends and we're all hanging out. The first time I did go to the war zone, I did go with my friend Mary Calvert, who's a photographer, but it was just her and I. We had filed all of our paperwork at the Pentagon. I remember it was such a big deal. We're filing our paperwork. We're getting our press passes, our press badges. I filed everything with ISAF. It used to be this whole application online that I would have to do every time I went into the war zone. Sometimes I would have to do training in the United States. And I did this with the DOD. So when I was out with the parajumpers, and I think you all can see behind me, probably not that well if you're watching on YouTube, you could see this right behind me. I have my Washington Times cut out and it's print. This was the original story that I did with the parajumpers, and we were out with them in the battlefield. And it was probably one of the most terrifying and exhilarating stories that we did. And it ended up being the most heartbreaking story that I ever did, because when I flew back to the United States and when I actually left the battlefield, several of the men that we had gone in to rescue, the parajumpers had gone in to rescue, were actually killed on that battlefield. So we brought their bodies back with us on the helos that day. And it was a very, very difficult experience. It was different for me as a woman telling those stories. I would always come from the perspective as a mother, like, what did their mother, what would go through her mind the minute that the person walked up to the door and informed them that their child had passed on, that their child had been killed in battle, that they were killed in action? I knew what was going through my mind. And that was the saddest part of the war, was this idea that so many of our troops, so many of the people that we sent there to fight for our nation died there. They died on those battlefields. And I would also have to tell the stories from the perspective of a woman and a mom and a journalist and a person. What does it mean to bring that objectivity to the paper, to the story, going out and interviewing people in villages in a land that I was totally unfamiliar with people that spoke a completely different language than me and practiced a completely different set of cultural norms. And in many ways, even though I was used to Islam, I grew up in Saudi Arabia and I was used to the Muslims and the Muslim religion. I was still very aware that it was different. It was different than the way that they handled a situation was very different than the way we would handle it here in the United States. Let me give you an example of this. And this is probably, we're still talking about perspectives here, right? Perspectives when covering wars. So for example, I would be able to sit with many of the Muslim tribal leaders, right, in Afghanistan. And sometimes it would be late night, the sun would be down. We'd have these kind of big feasts out underneath the stars. And it would be me and like 15 men, tribal leaders, their security, an armed gunman, a Hazar leader, whoever it was. I never would say it was a Loy Jirga, but it was like that's where people get together to debate ideas. But it was like a small gathering, and they were very kind to me, and we would talk about issues. And I always said, I must be third gender. That's what we would call ourselves, third gender women, because we were neither Muslim. So we didn't have to obey this. We weren't forced to obey the same rules that the Muslim wives did. The Muslim wives would never be eating at that same, place with their men. They would be eating behind a house. So I would have the opportunity to sit with the men, talk with the men, ask the men questions, and they never really saw me the same way that they would see their women. They didn't have the same kind of, I would say, respect for me that they did for the women that were Muslim. Although I was always treated, I was very grateful for that. I was always treated very well. But there was a reason I was treated well. Part of that was because I understood the tribal culture to a large extent, and I understood Islamic law. And I also understood that I was in a different country with a different set of circumstances and a different culture that did not see women as equals. And in fact, in many cases, this is how it was described. The fighting dogs were worth more than the daughters. So if I wasn't considered by some of these Muslim men to be respectable enough to be asked to go sit with their wives in the back, I was allowed to sit with the women. I was allowed to sit with the men. Then imagine what they thought of me, right? So different perspective. So I had to take that into consideration when I was doing interviews. And sometimes if it was an imam that I was dealing with, that's an Islamic leader from sometimes from the mosque, I would, at that point in time, I would take a secondary role to him. I would allow him to speak. I would allow him to talk up. I wouldn't interrupt. I wouldn't say that I knew something more than him. I would allow him to be the leader, because there were so many instances and so many times when women were killed in those circumstances. It has happened. It happened a year before I had gotten to Afghanistan. I remember it was 2007. A young lady from one of the Humit groups, an American Humit group, was set on fire by a man she was having an argument with over a well. It took her 4 months to die. That was a pretty terrifying story. So I had to realize that no matter what, I was in somebody else's country and I was covering a war in their nation, and I had to do it differently. Hey, folks, gold and silver allow you to protect what you've worked so hard for and give you back the control and privacy that you need. And because reputation is so important to me, the only company I recommend is Allegiance Gold. Get $5,000 of free silver on a qualifying purchase when you tell them that Sara sent you. So don't wait. Call or click today, 877-702-7272. That's 877-702-SARA, SARA, or go to protectwithsara.com. We can't control the Biden administration, folks, but we can prepare. 877-702-7272. That's 877-702-SARA, SARA, or protectwithsara.com. So reporters that worked in Kabul and that worked in Afghanistan, we would spend a lot of time, after, on our breaks, whenever we weren't in the middle of the war zone. So if I wasn't in Helmand province with the troops, or I wasn't up in the Panjshir in the north with the tribes, or traveling around Afghanistan, we would go and meet up at these different locations inside Kabul. And one of them was the Gandamek Lounge. And it was so popular with journalists and spies and aid workers, and sometimes military officials would stop by there. You could get tea, you could get a sandwich if you were lucky. They might even sneak in some bacon or something in the morning for breakfast, although that was not, pork is not served in Islamic countries, but sometimes they would do that. Money was always a big calling card, even in, and especially in the war zones, but even in situations like that. And the owner of the Gandamek at the time was Peter Juvenal. He was a former BBC cameraman. And he married this amazing woman who was an Afghan woman. And it was really funny because her mom loved me. This woman, I just can't remember their names right now, but her mom loved me. And when I would go into the Gandamak, she would try to get me to divorce my husband to marry her son. So that's how much the mom liked me. She was so great. She was so funny. And so you would find there, this is like kind of an eclectic place, right? I described it a little bit like Tatooine. I would say the bar at night was more like Tatooine. It was like just a wild group of spies and people from all over the world that were working in Afghanistan that would show up there and start drinking. It was crazy. Like drinking in an Islamic, country with a war, a war ongoing. And, sometimes you just had to let it all out, right? You had to just take a break because it's so overwhelming. The war was so intense and so overwhelming. And even when you didn't realize, you weren't thinking of every detail, right? You're just living your life, right? You're just there, you're working. That's your job. You're getting the story. You're bringing it back. You're talking to people out on the war front. You're running into some of your old colleagues that you haven't seen in a while, like Tom Bowman with NPR or Chris Hondros, who has since passed away with Getty. He was killed in Libya. Tim Hetherington, all of these great names. Kimberly Dozier, what a great, phenomenal journalist she is with the Associated Press, has done so much incredible work. And by the way, she was wounded in Iraq, and thankfully she's a survivor and a strong woman, and was able to, she was part of that group of people that were willing to sacrifice everything. And as a woman working in a war zone where you are not going to be granted any kind of special extra niceties, right? Because you're a woman, you're not going to have anybody. Trust me, no one's going to carry your bags. You know who did? You know who would carry my bags? And in fact, he wrote me just a second ago, was my interpreter, Shireen. He would always be like, "Oh, Sara, let me carry your bags." And he would grab my bags and he would be so great. And many times he dropped me off at the Gandamak. Yes, he did, at night. And I would be like, Shireen, and we would go together, me and my friends. I had a friend who worked with the UN. She was a United Nations worker, and she would come with me. Her name was Tara. And we had so many fun nights, having dinner there, talking. Only one time I remember drinking a little too much. And I tripped over some ducks that were hanging out at the Gandamak. That was not a pretty sight. Although the French intelligence guys that were sitting at another table, they thought that was hilarious. I gave them a great laugh that day. So things can go sideways when you're in a war zone, but life was different, right? So I'm an American in a very conservative Muslim nation, trying to get the stories, trying to bring those stories home, and praying to God every single night that, that it was worth the risk and that I would come back the next day, because so many people didn't. And I think somewhere inside, all of us who worked in situations like that, all of us who struggled and, for some reason or another, our lives ended up being like my husband, like me, like others who never made it back, in these faraway lands, maybe with a little bit of adrenaline. We're a little bit of adrenaline junkies, but we're also, we really believe in telling the truth, in bringing the story to you, being able to tell you what's really happening so that you can make the best and most informed decisions. And more importantly than that, being able to tell the story as a woman from so many different perspectives, from that of an Afghan child, to that of an Afghan wife who had been abused, to that of a tribal grandfather who was watching his daughter, watching his granddaughter in a hospital. And I've told this story before, but watching his granddaughter, suffer with shrapnel in her body, and me telling myself, wow, this is not this was not what I was told when I was in the United States. I was terrified of, what was going to happen when I, encountered Afghan men. And here's this grandfather who prayed for me. Here's this grandfather who was sitting by his granddaughter's side. I mean, in some ways, as different as everything was there, in many ways, it was all the same, just different cultural perspective, right? But parents wanted to protect their children, and people wanted to live, and they didn't want to die. And people questioned the war, and people, whether they were Afghan or whether they were American soldiers or whether they were Italian or French or Portuguese, whoever was on the ground that I interviewed, there was always this human element that connected each and every one of us, that made us a part of something greater in such a horrible situation. But it made you realize how important and precious life is, right? And I don't know, and I don't ever want anyone to ever experience that. I don't want you ever, I hope never in your lives do you have to experience war, or that you have to lose somebody to war, or that you have to see a young soldier, torn to pieces by an IED or a bomb, and seeing and watching, those parajumpers like I have right behind me, gathering the pieces of his body to put him in a bag to bring him home to his mom and dad. I hope you never have to see that. But what I do want to share with you is those moments that make us all human. And I think sometimes when I look around what's going on in our country, what I see what's happening in our world, and I feel like it's so upside down. And I think to myself, I hope I'm not getting too tired of telling these stories. I do believe there are more good than bad. And I do believe that it is our duty, right? It is our duty to our children and to our nation and to our family and to our friends and to, more importantly, to God, to continue fighting for what's right and continue to put things on the line and take chances and take risks. My life was forever changed. I could tell you I had moments where, and I know it's so hard for some people. I know I even have some friends, they don't want to risk, they're just like, no way, I don't want to go there. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to take that chance. It's different when you actually do. You have a different perspective internally about your life and the world that you live in. And that's not for everybody. But it teaches you a lot about survival. It teaches you a lot about who you are as a person. It teaches you a lot about the world around you and what motivates people and what doesn't. More importantly, I felt that it connected me with something greater, and I know that if you talk to other war correspondents, they will probably tell you the same thing. And they'll tell you how important that was. It also shows you that no matter how bad things get, there are funny moments, crazy moments, funny moments. I feel like I've talked 25 minutes about so many things, but okay, let me give you one funny story before I end this. And I promise you, I'm going to come back with a more concise, and I'm going to give you a how-to. If you're ever traveling in the wilderness, I'll give you a how-to, what you need to pack, what you need to do, what I learned over all the years of traveling in war zones and working on the front lines. I'll do something fun with you on that. But let me tell you a really funny story. So in Afghanistan, of course, as a woman, what are you going to do? You got to use a restroom. Most of the restrooms are outhouses, right? And they're either where you go up into the mountains or you're in Helmand province. This story in particular took place in the Panjshir Valley. And my friend Shardil Qatari can vouch for it. He's probably going to be listening to this podcast because he's here in the United States now. But me and my friend Mary, we were up in Panjshir, and the only toilets that they had up there at this farmhouse in the Panjshir Valley was this outhouse that was literally on stilts about 30 feet up off the edge of this like little cliff behind the house. 30 feet is a lot for me. I would think I'd be pretty scared. And there was a hole and everything went straight down. And they did that because, by the way, there are these ginormous camel spiders out there. Huge, 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 huge. I mean, they look like something like dinosaurs, right? They're huge. They're terrifying. And they will run towards you to go in your shadow if you encounter one and the light's just right, they'll just chase you everywhere. So it's pretty scary. I've run into a few of those. But this story in particular, of course, we're getting ready to leave the mountains in Panjshir. You can't stay past sundown. There's a whole thing. They have guards at the gate. It's like almost Shangri-La when they open these gates and let you into the Panjshir Valley. You feel like you've gone back in time into some kind of beautiful film. I can't even describe it, with cascading mountains and rivers and waters and beautiful fruits. It's incredible. Incredibly beautiful place. One of the most beautiful places in the world. But they don't have a lot of like toilet paper and stuff. So this family had bought like special tissue for us, apparently, because we were eating at their house that day. And it was bright purple tissue. And this bathroom on a cliff. Suffice to say that Mary and I had very purple behinds the whole way back to Kabul. And I think it was a mark of greatness. Funny story. They saw it as something very important. They were like, look what we got you. What they didn't realize that it was tissue paper meant for decorating parties and such. And it was very, very purple. By the way, not easy to get off your rear. That story and life in the war zone, that's just a little bit of what I have to share with you. Look, folks, I appreciate everything, everything you've done, everything you've written me. There have been so many changes happening in our world. And I just want you to know that no matter how difficult times get, no matter how many pieces of tissue toilet paper that are dyed purple you run into in your life, things always get better on the other end. They just always do. You just got to give it time. Thank you so much for being a part of the Sara Carter Show. Thank you so much for following me on Truth at Sara Carter Official, on Twitter at Sara Carter DC, and on Instagram at SCarterDC. God bless you. God bless our troops and our overseas journalists putting everything on the line in Ukraine and everywhere else in the world. God bless our beautiful nation, and God bless the great state of Texas.